Excellence of Family Engagement in the Justice System. My name is Jason Smith. I'm Youth Policy Consultant. Youth Policy Consultant for the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency. So I guess the process we'll take is we'll have two presenters do their presentation, and then we'll go into like the discussion with you guys, okay? So let me read the introductory biographies for both the presenters. First, we're going to start with Jessica Sandoval, who is the Vice President and Deputy Director for the Campaign for Youth Justice, which is based in Washington, D.C. Jessica is responsible for the development and implementation of organizational priorities, strategic planning and partnerships, and as a founding staff member of the organization, she is responsible for managing the campaign strategies, providing technical assistance for state campaign partners, and establish several initiatives to involve those who oppose prosecuting youth as adults, including affected families and incarcerated youth. Prior to joining the Campaign for Youth Justice, Jessica served as Program Associate at the National League of Cities Institute for Youth Education and Families. She was also the Juvenile Justice Federal Policy Coordinator at the Center for Youth as Resources, and as well, formerly was the Policy and Resource Development Specialist for the National Youth Advocacy Group, the Coalition for Juvenile Justice. And the next we'll hear from Lois DeMott, who is a Soros Fellow and is the coordinator of the Michigan Family Participation Program. Lois is a longtime advocate for those who have wound up in the criminal justice system, particularly for the most vulnerable and population in their families. Her work began through a personal journey involving her 15-year-old son's incarceration in the adult system. Lois co-founded a statewide family-led organization, Citizens for Prison Reform in 2011. Lois helped to shed light on the needs for reforms in an article published by the Detroit Free Press, and then an NBC documentary in 2012 with Ted Koppel on juveniles in isolation across the United States. Previously, Lois worked for the Association for Children's Mental Health before she was awarded in May of 2014 with the Soros Justice Fellowship through Open Society Institute. Lois's project, the Family Participation Program, includes working within the Department of Corrections at 4 pilot prisons, implementing a family advisory board to work with MDOC, and hosting gatherings, trainings, and communities. The Family Participation Program is hosted by the Michigan Council on Crime and Delinquency and works to assist families in learning how to navigate through the system, advocate for their incarcerated loved ones, and serve all who have a loved one inside of the prison system. So before we get started, if we can do a hand survey, how many of you guys in the audience are professionals that work directly with families of folks involved with the justice system? Rather, it could be court officials, community service providers, youth or adults, who works directly with them. Who is in the audience is a family member or a formerly incarcerated person? So, goodness. So, hopefully, we have a good discussion once the time comes. One of the handouts that I gave is a survey that allows you to rate the way that your agencies or organizations, how you feel like they do in regards to family engagement. So if you can answer them as honest as possible, and if anyone doesn't have a pen, I can share one with you. If you are a family member, you can rate it as if it's within your own experience. And so we'll use that when the discussion time comes. Okay, so without further ado, Jessica. Oh, sure. We're going to put them in the back. There you go.
So Jason, am I just using the arrow?
Yeah.
Oh, I am. Here you go. Can everyone see this, okay? Am I disturbing anyone's views? Okay. Try to be as dynamic as possible. Welcome. Again, my name is Jessica Sandoval, and I'm with the Campaign for Youth Justice. And although we are a national policy advocacy organization, much of the work that we do is actually in states, in states like Michigan and others that you probably heard today, where we're looking to change the laws to update what we know in what the research says. So we've worked over the last 10 years with about half of the states in some type of policy change. But with that also comes with, in 2005, when we were first founded, we were founded by a family member whose child was facing transfer to the adult court. And she was very wealthy, she was white, and she was an attorney. And she said, if I can't get my kid out of trouble, I don't think anybody can. And so this is a fundamental issue that I think we need to address. And in 2005, nobody was talking really about kids tried as adults. This is an issue that our organization has taken on as a sole focus. So we've kind of focused like a laser on this issue to bring not only public awareness, but really the policy changes that need to accompany what we know about kids, what we heard today about brain research, what the Supreme Court has said. We're really trying to take all of those things and bring that into focus. But because we were founded by a family member who gave us our first seed money, we feel like it's really important, and it's very much a kind of tenet or cornerstone of the work we do is to have the people who are most impacted work with us both at the national level but also in the states that we work with. So we developed this Family Comes First workbook as a way, and I should grab it so I have a visual, as a way of kind of through the work that we've been doing, people kept saying, well, how do we know what works and what's the, like how do we get started, and we don't really know what we're doing. And so we put together this workbook, and that's essentially what I'm going to talk about, and then I'm going to turn it over to Lois to talk about Michigan and families engagement in general. But we were asked by the Annie Casey Foundation to write this workbook and help to disseminate it, and it will be for sale today if anybody's interested, but I can certainly pass it around if anybody wants to see it. It's $20, and I'll pass it around so people can kind of get a feel for what's in the workbook. It's very much a guide for agencies or organizations to look at how we engage families kind of on multiple levels, where to start and how to get started. So really the purpose of the workbook was to kind of develop a shared understanding. What we found was there was kind of this lacking of a shared understanding of what family engagement really is. And what we heard from folks were, well, we do family engagement. And then we would say, well, what is it? And then nobody could either explain it, or they weren't really doing it, or it was not really beneficial, and it kind of hurt families and young people. And so we thought, there were some lacking pieces to the work that people were doing. We wanted to make sure that there were policies that weren't built on myths of what a bad parent is or why families are the problem. We wanted to build something that was actually an asset-based approach, knowing that most kids are going to go back to their families. How do we put them in a position of power and strength to do that? And then we wanted to connect family engagement kind of to broader system reform work. So if there are going to be, if people are working on issues of reducing incarceration, or closing down detention facilities, or removing youth from the adult system. There's kind of this broader system reform that's happening, and we wanted to make sure that these pieces were all very much connected. We also found that the models that we saw, or the things that we heard people saying, were very much based in this idea of how to get families to participate in the status quo versus developing something about how it works for everybody in the future. So, so that was another thing that we thought maybe we could talk about, and really why we wanted to write the workbook. So the methodology actually that went into developing this was an extensive literature review. So we decided, well, we're going to see what people have to say about what is happening on this family engagement spectrum. And what we found was child welfare and other child serving agencies had been doing this for a long time. We saw in foster care, child welfare, that there was a lot of family reunification programs, that if there was not a family member that was an immediate family member available, they employed all of these resources to find somebody somewhere down the family tree, and we just didn't see that happening in the juvenile justice system, and obviously not with kids in the adult court either. So we looked at mental health, the education fields, again, child welfare, to figure out where do all of these things intersect, and what are the principles that we can bring to the juvenile justice folks to also create something that is more holistic in its approach, and comes, again, like from an asset-based place. So we also, we worked with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention to bring together a bunch of families regionally. So we did 4 regional meetings, bringing everybody together. Most of the people that we brought together had a kid in the juvenile justice system or the adult criminal justice system. And they talked about, for the most part, why the system was so detrimental. We had very few parents that came to say the system did my child well. And I think to the feds, they were a little surprised by that. I don't know why they were surprised, but I think they were like, really? So nothing we're doing is helping you as a family member or your child? Okay, there's gotta be something. So there was a lot of digging. We also did multi-day site visits to jurisdictions where they had other juvenile justice successes like JDAI sites and others to talk about what are you guys doing as service providers or agencies to involve people who've been most impacted in the kind of day-to-day policy work. Do you have people on your hiring team when you have new hires? Do you have them on your training team? Do you have families as part of your everyday work in that not only the care of their own children, but the care of building better policies? And then we conducted surveys of system stakeholders who are part of the Annie Casey JDAI Alternative Network and the Juvenile Correctional Administrators. And we sent out surveys to all of them. So we got a lot of feedback. And also, once we had a draft, we sent it to all of the family members we've ever worked with to see a draft, tell us what we were, if we were on point or if we were missing something. So we did put in quite a bit of work on developing this workbook for the masses. So here's some things that we found. I'm sure there's nothing on here that is shocking, but there were kind of 6 main findings from the focus groups. And I was lucky enough to really moderate the focus groups with OJJDP. So I was part of pretty much all of them. I developed most of, if not all of the questions. I got to be part of who we got to invite, so that was really great. And what we found were families kind of lacked the basic information about their system, about their rights, leaving them unprepared and very confused about what was happening with their children or child. Families also felt a lot of shame and stigma when their child was arrested. I've worked with family members who been asked to leave their church community, asked for their children not to come back to their local school, friends and family kind of removing themselves from their social networks. And we heard this over and over again. Some families saw their child's arrest as another manifestation of racism or classism, just another, my kid's just another statistic. And that's really how, they saw it. A lot of families said, my kid's just being a kid. Why is my kid being criminalized for what we know is just adolescent behavior, right? And so why did my kid penetrate the system so much deeper than X happened? Or, when he got in trouble before, this is what happened. And so sometimes the families saw their kids as getting in trouble as a cry for help. And then some of our families said, well, I called the police on my own child because I felt like he or she was out of control, and that I thought that the police were gonna help me. And I thought we were gonna be able to get services for my family, for my kid, and that isn't what happened at all. In fact, my kid was, charged as an adult, and because the situation was became a domestic violence situation, got charged as an adult, and now I have no parental rights. I don't even get to, be part of that. And then I think lots of parents came and said that they really thought they were going to get the services they needed, and they thought that the court system, we're going to fight this out in court. These charges they're bogus, or you were with me, you have an alibi, so we're going to take this to court, and we're going to, the truth is going to be there, and light will be shed on this. And what ended up happening was, that kid ended up getting a life without parole sentence after the court date was said and done. And so I think that there was kind of a wide variety of experience, but none that were really that positive. The families, I think, that did have, I see that 4 and 5, let's see. Oh, no, okay. And the families that did talk about having a positive experience was that they were kind of engaged in their kids' case management. So if they lived in a place where there were wraparound services or services available for them to be involved, not only as a family who was trying to heal or learn, they felt like their kids were getting services as well, and that those kids kind of never went on to commit other crimes, etc. So I would say that that was a very small number of families in our focus groups. So why do system stakeholders find it hard to engage families? Anybody have any thoughts? Besides the ones that are-
I find that big bullying, like parents a lot of times for like just behaviors.
Blame. Yep. Anybody else?
Lack of trust of the system.
Lack of trust for the system. Yep. Confidentiality. Yep. Well, those were obviously all things that we found. It's in our surveys. People just found it very difficult to engage families for whatever reasons that are there that you all have noted. I think that there has been this label as like the bad parent, right? So the parent who is on drugs or isn't around or maybe is incarcerated and can't be there to parent their children do get that kind of bad parent label. And then that's kind of where things kind of start and end for that family. And it's not one where, I think everybody was probably there when Abby said, you don't throw your kid into the deep end of the pool and expect them to learn how to swim on the first try, right? And I think that those kinds of applications also get applied to parents. It's like, well, you sucked at this the first time, so we're assuming you're going to just suck at it the second, third, and fourth time, so we're not even going to give you a chance. And I think that that's been really difficult and certainly something that we have talked with stakeholders about. And they say, well, what about, the parent who is, that we see who doesn't come to court with their kid? And my question is did you ever try? Have you ever reached out? Have you gone to their home? Have you, asked the pertinent questions to maybe get into some of the answers? That family is probably in multi-generational trauma, and there's ways to deal with that. But if you don't ask the question, I think it's really hard to start to find those answers. So where we found some consensus, oh, did I go too far? Oh. No, these are just extra. So where the areas of consensus are is system professionals will often say parents don't understand their rights, and the parents will say we don't understand our rights. And so there is a place there, I think, for learning, and one certainly something that we address in our work. But it's also that families, when we talk to families and we surveyed them and we were in these focus groups, they just didn't even know where to find the information. It was like, well, my kid's never been in trouble. I don't have any way of knowing what was supposed to happen or what I was supposed to do. There wasn't a pamphlet, or there wasn't somebody who said, this is, the next step. It was like the police came to my door, arrested my kid, and then I wasn't even sure what to do. I didn't even know where my kid was being held. Once I did find out, I didn't know what the visiting hours were or how I could transport myself to get there. So I think there are lots of barriers. And when we ask system stakeholders about, well, do you provide transportation? So in DC, our youth prison is not in DC. It's in Maryland, and it's probably a good, I don't know, what did you say, kind of 45-minute drive from the District of Columbia. And a lot of people in DC don't have cars because we have a really good, reliable public transportation system. So if your kid gets committed in DC under the Department of Juvenile Services, that's a 45-minute commute that you can't figure out how to make. And so it was like, well, are you guys providing any type of transportation so that you and that child can have a relationship and be engaged with each other? And so that transportation cost has now been built in. There's a van that picks folks up at certain points and those kinds of things, so they can actually get their kids out there. For the kids who are part of DC's prison system, which we don't really have, it's all Bureau of Prisons, those kids get shipped all over the country. And so a kid from DC very likely ends up in California. And probably 5 or 6 years ago, there were 18 families that we took from DC to South Dakota to see their children. Because there was a Bureau of Prison facility that they were contracting with for all of the kids who were under 18. And these parents some of them hadn't seen their kids in 2.5 years or longer. And when we got to the facility to see their children, it was just before Christmas. These mothers were like, my boy is a man. It's been so long since I've been able to see him. I can't even wrap my head around this. And I think that, I think what sometimes the system forgets is that their children who are still growing and have needs to be connected to their community and their church groups and their families, and yes, maybe they made a mistake, but all of us are better than our biggest mistakes we've ever made, right? And so, so as part of that trip, actually, the facility, I think, thought we were there for this dog and pony show. So they cleaned up really nicely and, showed us all the artwork that the kids had done and treated us very nice, made sure we were fed, and the parents got to spend 2 whole days with their kids in a room like this with no shackles, nothing. We had a Washington Post reporter with us, and so that reporter wrote about this experience. Now, has anybody ever been to Devil's Lake, North Dakota? Anybody heard of Devil's Lake, North Dakota? Okay, so we're in DC. It's December. Many of us are traveling through Chicago. As you can imagine, we all get stuck in either Indianapolis or Chicago or somewhere in between. Eventually, we all get to Fargo, which is obviously the closest airport. It is now a blizzard. And the Department of Corrections has to come pick us up in their prison vans. So now all of us are piled into these prison vans going to Devil's Lake, which is another 3 or 4 hour drive. So the Washington Post reporter writes the story, and the title is "To the Ends of the Earth," because it was like literally, how do you get to this place? Even if somebody had the means to get to Devil's Lake, it was very difficult to do. And yet I think people are so disconnected from this idea that, well, you know, your kid is in trouble and so this is where they go. And without really realizing that this engagement piece and this connection piece is actually what the research says keeps people from not recidivating, right? So, so as part of that article, DC decided not to do business with that facility anymore. So we got that contract taken out. So we're still trying to bring kids closer and closer to home, but South Dakota isn't an option anymore. So, so we're hopeful that, you know, we can continue to bring and shed light on those kinds of issues. Benefits system, let's see. Benefits the system stakeholders report by becoming more family friendly. So have any of you experienced your organization, agency, or somebody you've been served by moving in this direction, where it's becoming more family-centered, more family-centric, more family-friendly? Nobody? So when we have talked with folks, essentially this is, you know, what they're saying is, you know, again, no surprises here, right? Higher compliance rates, easier to deal with, lower recidivism rates, greater access to success. We're able to offer maybe more programs, or we can do more because the kids aren't acting out as much. Increased quality of policies. I mean, these are not, you know, this isn't a major epiphany. Obviously, if you engage people, this is what happens. And so it's no different if it's young people or adults. You know, there are benefits to doing business differently. And so I think, you know, getting out of this idea that I work for a system or an agency and I'm going to go work for the status quo doesn't have to be. I think there are some very simple ways of creating a better, more robust, family-centered approach. So what you'll find in the workbook is we have this kind of 5 features of a transformed justice system. And this is what we heard families really wanted, right? Again, I'm not blowing your minds here, but they want to be involved in their kids' plans at all levels. They want to have support before trouble starts or as trouble starts. They want to be able to know where to go and how to get the help. We hear a lot that families want culturally competent services. So, you know, what might work for my kid might not work for yours, but I want to be able, you know, to have an equitable approach in this. So where can we go to get our kids treated? They want their kids to be safe, right? Who doesn't want their kids to be safe and prepared and really be able to see their future as something successful and not something that is shamed and stigmatized? And so really, you know, no secrets here. People want to be connected to their peers. They want to be connected to folks who've gone through this before, who've been part of it. And I know certainly in the work with families that we've done as a national organization, you know, families call us all the time and say, my kid just got arrested, what do I do? My kid committed suicide in an adult facility and I don't want his life to be in vain, so help teach me how to be an advocate, or what kind of laws can we change? And so I think before we label all of our families bad parents, I think we have to give folks the chance to rise to the occasion in terms of being part of their children's treatment. So this is what we came up with. It's a fancy little chart, probably can't see it that well. Oops, sorry, right there. This is the family model, and this is the framework we came up with as we wrote this document. So appropriately called the family model. This is where we kind of looked at the 5 features that we just mentioned. What kind of system level ingredients would be necessary to kind of create and accomplish this model. So we asked ourselves a couple questions. How are we going to do it? And how can we make the system more responsive to family and young people's needs? So are any of you familiar with the system of care model? Assuming most of you, right? This doesn't probably look that different. We borrowed heavily from that model because I think it's common language, people use it. We also used peer-to-peer support examples as we were developing this. But yeah, so family actually stands for all of these different types of things. So family stands for, or F stands for families, having primary decision making. A for access, M for meeting the mutual goals and needs, I for interagency, community, collaboration, L for leadership, both obviously on the part of families and systems, Y for youth, being fully prepared for their futures. So that's how we kind of came up with family. We used all of these pieces to come up with that nice little acronym. I know that a lot of you, based on the survey we did before, when you raised your hand, work with families and young people. So I will be curious to see how you rate yourself on the survey we handed out. But I did want you all to know that the workbook has about 40 specific examples of where other people are doing this and doing it pretty well. And I'm happy to obviously answer questions. But you can see on here, there's several state examples, some local and regional ones, and some national examples. And then ultimately we came up with these recommendations. We have federal and state recommendations, but I figured for the sake of this particular presentation, that these are more state focused and agency focused. So agencies having contact with children really have the responsibility to coordinate family engagement efforts. So, have you hired somebody to do this? Do you have a staff person who's leading this? Have you considered hiring a family member or a young person that you know who's received your services before to coordinate something like this? I know in DC, we worked with a group called FABI in Virginia, and the mother who ran that organization ultimately ended up getting hired by the Department of Youth Rehabilitation Services in DC to run theirs. And now she's a program officer at the Andy Casey Foundation. So, so she certainly, has climbed up the ladder, but has done a very good job in DC to bring families together, to have family meetings at the center once a month, if not more, family visitation, if there are issues, coordinating all of those kinds of things, home visits, etc. So it's certainly something folks in the room should consider. A second recommendation is every system conduct a survey or an assessment on how to develop specific, implement specific strategies on how to use this family model, or something that you found that maybe works better for your agency. 3 is having any agency that has responsibility for youth, identifying organizations or initiatives that can be part or extensions of the work that you do, collaborations. As an agency, maybe you can't provide all of these services, but as an individual who's well connected, and who knows the right people to connect to, you can build these collaborations. You can be a conduit for that. And you can bring them into your agency's work to do some of this. Agencies and systems developing a basic guide. We heard over and over again that families didn't have even a single piece of paper to tell them what to do next. So I think this is pretty low-hanging fruit. How many of you have this as part of your agency or organization? And then we wonder why families don't know what to do. So I think pretty low-hanging fruit, but certainly fruitful for those who need it and who look to know what to do next, right? Even at the DMV, they tell you what to do next. So I think as part of their children's care, they should also be afforded that information as well. And then lastly, the agencies should examine any fiscal policies that incentivize incarceration and residential placements over community-based options. Looking at how to keep kids in communities. That's what we need. We do not need them in detention centers. How many of you work in a detention center or have worked in a detention center? You have a lot of status offenders in your detention center?
Well, we're getting away from that now.
Yeah. Because the work that we have found makes it difficult is particularly for those of us who are advocating to bring kids from the adult court system back, particularly for places that have the lower ages of court jurisdiction. We know those kids are misdemeanant, first-time, non-violent offenders, clogging up jails, and we're asking the juvenile folks to bring kids back, right? These are what these law changes are about. Well, it's hard to incentivize them to bring kids back from the adult system if you're locking up runaways and truants in your detention centers. So I think that there's some front-end work that has to happen with a larger goal in mind about what's our ultimate goal. Is it to have kids originating in juvenile court? If that's the original goal, the juvenile justice system has some work to do as well. But I think that by using the kids in the adult side piece really does help in terms of policy to push juvenile justice to reform as well. So it's kind of a deep end intervention that really does help to right size juvenile justice because that's where we think and know young people should actually originate.
Question.
Yeah.
Did anything like a family advisory council organization, did that develop as a possibility? What are the options?
Well, Lo's going to talk a little bit about that. It didn't develop because people have never been engaged in that way. So it wasn't like an original idea like, oh, if we had a family council, we'd be able to do this. I think some people were like, wouldn't it be great to be able to go into facilities and monitor what was happening or get a better idea from that side, but not a lot of council or advisory groups popped up. We certainly have seen them happen, but from the family side, they wouldn't even know what that was because it's never been an option or an opportunity. So obviously, as part of the last one is really just states developing these incentives to fund prevention, diversion programs, and community-based programs. We know that anything we can do in a facility, we can do better in the community. And so I think that that's really where the focus should be, is bringing kids back. I think all of you would agree that you probably could do better work with kids and families if they were in their community. So that's the end of our spiel on the Family Comes First workbook. Our website is here. See a little bit about what's included in the workbook. I passed it around, and again, it's available. Are we holding questions?
Yeah, it's okay. We're going to hold questions until the Thank you. If anyone missed the handouts before we got started, they're towards the back of the room. Okay?
That wasn't provided.
No, that's not.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
PowerPoint. But we can certainly. Okay, so I am here to really share the grassroots piece of the work that I am doing here in Michigan. And I often have to remind myself and families that I'm working with that our lives begin to end the day that we become silent about things that matter, by Martin Luther King Jr. I say that because what I found over the years, often as families, we're taught and we have this perception that we are to remain silent, that we're not to be involved. And so today what I'm going to be sharing with you is really the back end of my story, of what has led me into doing this work, because this has been a 180 turnabout for me. I was a transcriptionist. I used to think you do the crime, you do the time. I used to think that our communities were safe because bad people were locked up. And I never knew that one day I would love a prisoner. So with that, I'm going to share a little bit of that, and that has now led me into the work that I'm doing regarding family engagement. So this is my son.
He's cute.
So I'm going to primarily share with you the family engagement piece that I'm doing is primarily now in the adult system, dealing with the prison system. I do also some work with the county jails. But I want you to think outside of the box and to realize that what I'm going to share with you, I believe, are possibilities in all of these systems, in the juvenile system, in our jail systems, and that we need to take these ideas and move them forward. So this here is the journey of my son, and this actually is a photo page we put together for one of his parole hearings. And unlike, I believe most of you were there through this morning, so I feel like my story, every family has their own story and our own experience. And my story and our experience is very different than many. And as you can see, my son had many opportunities growing up. We went on vacations across the country. Even though we saw and knew at a very young age that he had emotional challenges, we knew something was not, right. Even as young as the age of 3 and 4, we sought out private help and then became involved with community mental health. So by the time that he was 9 years old, he'd had his first psychiatric stay. By the time he was 11, he was diagnosed as bipolar. He had actually tried living with family for 7 months, and they found the same things that we experienced. And by the time he was 13, he'd actually had several stays in the juvenile detention facility. He had been placed out of state 3 times in placements. And at the age of 13, he was actually given a blended sentence. So I don't know how many of you understand or know what that is, but he was given this blended sentence, charged as an adult. His crime was going into a little Caesar's Pizza store with a toy gun. He got scared and ran out. He was the one that was caught, not the adults that drove him there. They were strangers. And this was part of his bipolar, the manic phase. He would run. And so he was the one that was charged. And again, certainly, yes, he needed to pay for what he did and he needed help. But the sentence, the blended sentence, actually was hanging over his head. And what that meant was they were giving him one last chance. They sent him to a facility in Iowa. And there, that facility was peer run.
It was run by the kids. That was what they considered therapy. And they had no other therapists on their staff. Failed after 7 months in the program, was brought back and went into the Michigan Department of Corrections at the age of 15. This was a photograph taken by the newspaper in our local community, and his case was plastered even at the age of 13. His name was released. And it was a life-changing event, not only traumatic for him, but for our family, because there was no keeping this quiet. It was exposed to everyone within our community. In this actual photo, you see that he's in a Bam Bam suit. We showed up at court, and we knew that we hadn't been able to see him. He'd been held at the county jail, but we didn't know why, and it's because he had been attempting to take his life by slitting his wrists with spoons. And so we showed up to court, and this is how we saw our son. That day, the judge said to us, "Your son will receive the mental health help he needs." So the judge knew and admitted that he had a severe mental health diagnosis. And he said he will receive the help he needs inside the prison system. We believed that because we didn't know any better. So all of this time, while he was in these juvenile settings, I can tell you that I felt very walled off, that I often felt like they saw us as the problem. They were not used to families who wanted to be involved. And at that point, I really hadn't learned how to advocate, really in a positive way. There was great stress for all of us in the family with what we were dealing with. So this is actually a photograph taken by Richard Ross. I don't know how many of you here have seen his work, but he has fabulous work that really shows the insides of our juvenile facilities. Once my son Kevin was inside the Michigan Department of Corrections, what we found was that the judge didn't know or understand what goes on inside the system, and that in fact he was not going to easily receive the mental health help he needed once he was inside that system. He made it 7 months, so within the Department of Corrections, once you start receiving tickets, you start having loss of privileges, you lose more and more things, and then you wind up more and more locked down with fewer visits. So after he was in the system for 7 months, he was transferred to the inpatient psychiatric prison. Okay, so he was only 15 by 2 months when he went into the prison system, just over 14. So here he was at 15 years old, and he was placed in with our most mentally ill men within the Michigan Department of Corrections. And the things that he saw and these other youth saw there, no child should ever experience or see. Amazingly enough, he started asking me to reach out and reach the other families of these children. And on the left, you see a letter here written by Kyle. This was one of the letters that he sent out to me to get to his family and asked me to start teaching them how to advocate. My son was the one who said, "Mom, you need to get on in Google. There are organizations who will help us." And so he really taught me how to become an advocate. On the right, you can see a letter from the 16-year-old. I know it's kind of hard to read. Amazingly enough, this letter we got, this kid was certainly bright enough to understand that his rights were being violated. He was in a mental health treatment program down in Adrian, yet he was being held 23 hours a day, sometimes 24 hours a day in solitary confinement. How can you get treatment in a program when you're being held in such conditions? And they were holding him in that manner. Again, keeping him separate by sight and sound was their purpose. The one thing that I want to raise that I feel often gets misconstrued. So we say we're holding them separate by sight and sound. Some of these kids, if they have to be placed in with the most mentally ill prisoners, there is no way to keep them separated truly by sight and sound. They are kept in a cell, yet they can hear and see everything that goes on around them. And that's how it was for my son and for these other youth who had significant mental health needs. another young man that we met, that we assisted and worked with his family to get them more involved and try and help them to learn how to advocate. And here's his photo. You can see just how young he is. And yet they were placed in with adults. They all ended up in the mental health program, so there was no age limitation. So I started connecting and found American Friends Service Committee, an organization here in Michigan who advocates directly for prisoners. I went to a rally, and there I connected and met numerous other families and other organizations doing this work. And I learned horrific things. And the things that I'm sharing today, I'm just going to tell you that these are people who all, these photos, most of them have come directly out of the Michigan Department of Corrections, out of their records. These are real people here in Michigan who have suffered, and all of them lost their lives except for my son that's down on the restraint bed in the lower corner. So Jeffrey Clark and Timothy Souders both ended up dying within the Department of Corrections from dehydration. Both had mental illness. And then the man, Anthony McManus in the upper right, died of starvation up in Baraga. And I think, you know, these were, to me, what awakened my passion to do this work. Because I never would have known, had it not been for my son being in the system and me reaching out to other families and agencies and organizations, I never would have known that these kinds of things happen and occur, and that we have rights violations that are going on. So, you know, my son was in the system during this time, and I want to mention that his sentence when he went in was 5 months to 5 years. Because of the time that he served in Iowa and in the detention facility, his minimum sentence was 5 months. He had a parole hearing just 2 or 3 months after he went in. I didn't even know I could put together a packet. He kept saying AROS. I thought that was a lady's name. That's an acronym within the Department of Corrections. So I went to this parole hearing, and this parole board member said, "This says he's 15. What's he doing here? This can't be right. This is wrong." And I said, "No, he's 15. This says he has mental illness. Why is he here? He should be out in our community getting help." So he gave him a release, a D-47. Within 2 weeks, we received a call from the facility there where he was at. And they told us that he, in fact, would have to stay in prison 2 more years because he wasn't old enough to go to the prison where they had the Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative. So that shows you how little I knew at that time. I did nothing about that. I took that answer, and I thought that there was nothing I could do. It would be different today had I known then what I do now. I'm sorry. So what occurred then was what I feared most. My son continued to receive all of these tickets. His behaviors were destruction of property, and that is something that we dealt with when he was very young, when he would become manic. He became a severe cutter while he was in Iowa, and the cutting only grew worse. And so they ended up placing him in solitary confinement, and I knew that he was going to end up taking his life. I knew that he was off from his medication at that point. And so I worked and advocated, and we did get him back into a residential treatment program at one of the prisons. But the photograph on the lower corner here are the photographs that I got out because I knew what he was describing. I knew what he was describing. In fact, the Attorney General's office had told us that they no longer could do within the Michigan Department of Corrections using the 4- and 5-point restraints. So I got the photos out. We ended up taking that to Jeff Garrett with the Detroit Free Press. And the reason for that was because I saw that the department was not willing to look at changing their overall policies. Yes, they got my son out, but that didn't address the rest who were left behind. He went on to do another 9 months, and he was sent up to Marquette and did 9 months there in solitary confinement, where he nearly lost his life there. And we were told, really, during all of that time, I began doing more and more advocacy, began pulling families together, and out of that grew Citizens for Prison Reform. We did letter writing campaigns around the juveniles that we saw in the system and around the conditions of solitary confinement, to our governor, to our legislators, and we really started digging in and really started bringing awareness. It really was about education and awareness and helping families to find their voices and to be able to understand that their voice does matter and it counts. So that was the beginning of Citizens for Prison Reform. But, you know, we were told by some of the legislators that the reason that he had been moved up to Marquette was to break down the family ties. Because, again, they thought that we were the problem. And amazingly enough, after he ended up leaving Marquette and had to have, you know, he was in very bad shape, brought back down to the inpatient psychiatric prison. He was taken to a prison, and there the doctors, for, you know, the first time said, you know, you've been on the same meds for 10 years and you've never gotten better. They put him on a new medication, and at that facility, they really believed in getting these people out and into treatment. So he was able to get into weightlifting and the Insanity Workout Program and a lot of programming that assisted him in getting better. So he was released in 2012, and until recently was doing very well, and now he's really beginning to struggle with PTSD. So we are on a new journey. So through Citizens for Prison Reform, brought families together for a one-time meeting, and they all said, no, we want this, we need this monthly. So we've been meeting since May of 2011. We meet here in Lansing. It's a statewide grassroots organization, and each month we have educational meetings. We actually have Rich Rienstra here, who's now the president of Citizens for Prison Reform. I think what I have learned most through all of this experience is that families need to learn to be empowered, to be able to share their stories, to be able to network and connect with other families so that they are not alone. The impact of incarceration on families, and within those families, as most of us know, there are often young children, and that's something that I really wasn't fully aware of. How many children we have in our schools that have someone, their parent, who is incarcerated, and it's something that they have to stay silent about. And sometimes they aren't even aware why their parent is gone. They've been told that they're away at a job or away at college. Because the level of stigma that families feel, they often sometimes don't share that information. So yes, the greatest prison people live in is the fear of what other people think. And I think that's what we have found. By creating family inclusion and family engagement within this system, we are beginning to break down some of those barriers. Often the stigma, the shame that families feel, and on the website for families. You had to dig in and read policy just to figure out how to set up phone, how to send money. And so we started sharing, we took families in and we started sharing with legislators that there was nothing. And one of them said, you know what, we can fix that quickly. And they put it in boilerplate that the Michigan Department of Corrections had to create an information packet. So that is now on their website. In the meantime, we created our own guide and we moved it out pretty quickly. And it's a very comprehensive guide. We have that available on Citizens for Prison Reform website and as well the Family Participation Program website. One of the other things that we began to address within the Michigan Department of Corrections, there's actually, it's a legislative administrative rule that says if a prisoner receives 2 substance abuse tickets, they lose their visits for 2 years to life. And that is something where we started seeing all these families come to us. You know, I probably have right now probably at least 12 families who have experienced this. The idea is that families are the ones that are bringing in the substance. Often, these are mentally ill prisoners who maybe cheat their medications. I mean, there's various reasons why you can get a substance abuse ticket. Yes, it can be for making alcohol or for having drugs. but it can be for minor things as well. And so we started talking with the director. And basically, I really started pressing in with the Department of Corrections, developed really, I was a strong advocate, not only for my son, but as well for a lot of these other people that we saw that weren't getting adequate care or treatment. And, you know, I just started saying to the Department of Corrections, it is time for families to be at the table. It is time for us to have our voices heard. We are hugely impacted by this system, yet we are often not considered. We have ways that you could save money, but we're never asked. And so these meetings began a couple of years ago. They weren't real frequent, but we did see some things happen, such as we took in the phone contract. And in the phone contract, it stated that at all the prisons and on the prisoner units, there had to be posters telling about the phone system. Those were nowhere. So we highlighted all of these things, and they brought in the phone company. So here we sat, families, the phone company, PCS, and some of the Department of Corrections administration. And so we did get some of the things addressed that were not being followed in that phone contract. That's just one example. The other big thing that we have seen, and I know if you're working in the juvenile system, you certainly have to address this. If you're working in the jail system, I'm very concerned it's not being addressed. That is an authorization form that every person needs to sign, just like when you go to the doctor, so that if you have a medical crisis, someone else can know about your condition. Currently, within our Department of Corrections, that is not given to prisoners. They have to know to ask for that. So we have families who can't, you know, they're not hearing from their loved one. They call the prison and they're told they're in the hospital, but we can't tell you why. So you don't know if they got stabbed, beat up. You don't know what happened, what their medical condition is. And so that is something that they now, legislators actually just last October, made them create, again, part of boilerplate. We still have a lot of work to do on that end. It's now a form that they created, but it still is not being a part of their intake, and it's not provided to all of the prisoners in all of our prisons. So really, through all of this work, I realized that I wanted to be able to work more closely and to be able to access families who are part of the system. That's a very difficult thing to figure out. How do you reach families? So I ended up writing for a Soros Fellowship and received that this last May through the Soros Foundation and implemented the Family Participation Program. The Michigan Department of Corrections, amazingly enough, wrote my letter of recommendation for that Soros Fellowship, and they agreed to pilot prisons. So currently there are 4 pilot prisons where posters are hung inside the facility. I was able to go in and speak with the prisoners that are from each unit to be able to present about the program and let them know that it's available. Not sure how many of you are aware, but in Michigan, we were given the number about a year ago that only 12% of our prisoners receive visits. Only 12%. Yet on the Michigan Department of Corrections website, under reentry, they state that they understand and know that family support and families are the one who actually assist prisoners when they come home. So they're well aware of it, and I think they're beginning to listen to us. So through this program, I have volunteer advocates out in communities, and as well, I'm doing regional workshops, trainings, helping families understand like how to email into the system rather than call, because often phone calls don't get returned. Some real basic tools and information that help them to lower their stress and to also assist staff so that they're not getting bombarded with things that families can find without having to call in. And then lastly, Director Hines recently has agreed to creating a family advisory board under my program. So we have different family members and release people from across Michigan who are serving on that board. And we're beginning to work on policy issues that we believe families need to have more input on, and that we can help create accountability and positive change within the system through our work. So I believe that's the basic information that I really wanted to share with you. But again, while most of this, what I'm doing now is in the adult system, I believe a lot of this we need to be carrying out within our jails and our detention facilities. The families need to have their voices heard, and they need to be a part of inclusion and be engaged. So thank you.
So we have about 8 minutes left in this session for questions and comments. If there's anything that you guys want to ask or any thoughts after hearing the presenters, feel free to share. If you completed the engagement surveys and feel comfortable sharing how you rated your agency or organization's experience in engaging families and forming effective partnerships, please feel free to share.
So I don't do direct service in my organization. Our organization, we're a statewide organization, Prevention Network. My part of that organization, my part is to coordinate Parenting Awareness Michigan, which I've been doing for about 18 years. I've been aware of prisoner reentry programs, although the talk about that over the last couple of years has been not as big as it was maybe 5 years ago, and lists were shared with us that there were coordinators throughout the state that we could get in touch with if we wanted to provide information and resources. So with that, how can an organization like the one I work for be helpful? We do 2 conferences every fall, and they are for people who work with parents and families. So I see that as a possible way to get information out. And there are other things, but I was just unaware of a lot of this, which I don't know if other people feel that way too, and maybe it's because I don't do direct service, but there must be something we can do. So I guess I need thoughts about that.
I would say certainly, and I don't know if you work with more the youth, the children?
We
It's
serve
across.
our people who work with parents and families.
Okay.
So parenting professionals in all kind of ranges and parent leaders.
Right. So certainly, yes, I would be willing to share the information out so that you could distribute it. I mean, I think that's a big piece of what we have to figure out is how do we find families who are in need of the supports and in all of these systems, because often we feel so alone and walled off, and it is hard to get the information. That's one of the most difficult pieces. So connect with me afterwards, and certainly I would love to share.
I actually work for the Department of Corrections, and I actually work for prisoner reentry. So I am more than willing to give you all the resources as far as, yes, we still have a listing, a community resource guide that lists all the community coordinators and all the sites. I also want to say that I've been involved with prisoner reentry since the beginning, and I want to put it out there that not all corrections staff are terrible, horrible human beings. I just want to say that. I understand that you've had a terrible experience and I know your story, but I also want to say that there's many of us that really, really want to do this work and want to help. I do a lot of work with special populations, including youth, and paid my own money to come to this conference because I believe in it. So I don't want all of you to leave this presentation feeling like corrections staff are the devil. And only
Not
thinking,
at all that way. We saw good people.
okay, I just wanted to put that caveat out there because I came in here thinking, okay, is this going to be a DOC bashing session? And I just want to say that prisoner reentry is alive and well, and we're doing a lot of great work. So don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And if you have any questions about what we're doing with prisoner reentry now and contacts in your local community, I can absolutely hook you up with those.
It's just another example of how we only hear about the bad stuff and not the good stuff.
True, yeah. So, I mean, that's why we wanted it to be a discussion where those who do serve these youth and families to share, some of the successes you had in engaging families as well. Yes.
First of all, I just want to thank you for your dedication. And then I guess my next question is for Jessica. Is there a reason, or a couple of questions, is there a reason why there aren't any facilities in DC and they're all transferred out? And then my other question is, what type of services are in place for the families to prepare them for the kids coming home or while they're away?
Yeah, so for DC specific, because DC is not a state, we're still a colony. We don't get the pleasure of running our own colony. So Congress runs it for us. Our highest level of government is the mayor. So the reason, the one facility that we did have that was a prison facility was closed many years ago. And because in DC, people are all, as Carmen mentioned on the panel this morning, are all prosecuted by the U.S. Attorney's Office. It's very much seen as a federal function, which is why they end up in federal prisons versus a state facility. And then to answer the question about families preparing, no, I mean, I think, I think every state's different. I think some states do a better job at reducing racial and ethnic disparities through planning and implementation and using, federal money and those kinds of things. I think some states are better at focusing on reentry than others. DC just isn't one of those places. We have pretty terrible service providers in our city. In fact, Carmen and I have been working on a diversion program for some time, and we can't identify one single youth-serving substance abuse program in our city. Not one. And, right, I don't think it's unique, and I think that goes to show the lack of preparation. So, as much as I am very much an advocate for community-based alternatives, we have to be able, much like with Redeploy Illinois, and these, designated dollars where we're taking it from DOC and investing in community-based alternatives, I think unless we invest in those community-based alternatives, and that there's some kind of assessment that they're good and they're providing great services, we just don't really have that in DC, and I don't think DC is unique in any way. I certainly haven't been, there isn't one state that I have gone to where I'm like, man, this is really great. I mean, little pieces, but not an entire, system from soup to nuts.
So then I guess I pose the question to anyone in this room, is anyone aware of any programs for families where kids go away to placement and they do something really unique or really great to work with the families?
So I supervise the MST program, multi-systemic therapy. We try to do more on the front end to prevent out-of-home placement, but we can also be utilized as a service when kids are coming out of placement to prepare families. MST works specifically with the caregivers of the youth and their holy colleges, so school and community, because usually those are the people who want the kids' behaviors to change more so than the kids. So it's an evidence-based practice that's worldwide, and it's been proven to be incredibly effective. There's about, I think, 10 counties in Michigan right now that have MST.
You mentioned in one of the recommendations that there be a family staff person. I don't know what you're calling it in certain areas, but and it relates to the question that the person from the Department of Corrections raised as well. What about, who have you found in the system already that's trying to connect with families? It seems to me it might be a person that's underutilized, and it is the chaplain. Is there have you found anybody that's working with families that's really helpful in the system right now?
Not that I have received anecdotally. I think once you penetrate a Department of Corrections, you're talking about a different ballgame there. I think that in terms of identifying, I think think the first step is for a system to be able to say, we actually want some family oversight, we want family participation, I think is very much a huge step forward into identifying that, but obviously there are people who work inside the system. You know, TJ talks a lot about a particular corrections officer who, you know, basically saved his life. So I think that there are people who can and do connect with people on the inside, but I don't know that it's one particular person that's been identified.
Okay.
All right, well, it is after 3:30 now, so I guess we'll end. But we'll make sure that you get the PowerPoint, so we want to get